In August, an alien survey ship landed in the Everglades. Their report said the region was empty. Low population, no defenses, nothing on that whole wet green map worth fearing. They were right about almost every line of it. They were wrong about 148 pounds of it, and it was already watching them. If you enjoy stories where humanity wins with patience instead of firepower, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this one with a friend who loves a good underdog. And stick around to the end, because I want to read your comment on the single moment that made you smile. Now let us move forward into the sawgrass, where the water is warm, the air is loud, and the quietest thing in the swamp is the one you should be afraid of. The Everglades in August is not a place. It is a mood, and the mood is hostile. By 8 in the morning, the air was already thick enough to lean on. The sawgrass stood shoulder high and still, the water underneath it warm as bathwater, and the sky in the west had that bruised look that meant the afternoon was going to be loud. Somewhere out past the cypress heads, a wood stork made a sound like a door that needed oil. Wade Buckley did not notice any of it. He had lived in HFY for 19 years, and a man stops noticing the weather the same way a man stops noticing his own heartbeat. Wade was 44, sun-cured, and worked for the State Wildlife Commission on the Panther team. His job, stripped of all the paperwork, was to know where the cats were. Florida had somewhere around 200 panthers left in the wild. 200, that was the whole species. Wade could tell you the home range of 11 of them from memory, and he could tell you the moods of one. That one was Deacon. Officially, he was Panther number 241. Wade had collared him 6 years ago as a lanky, unimpressed 3-year-old with a kinked tail and a cowlick of fur on his back that would never lie flat. Deacon was now 148 pounds of muscle and grudge, and he held a home range of about 200 square miles across Big Cypress and the eastern edge of the Fakahatchee Strand. 200 square miles, one cat, and he did not share. That Tuesday morning, Wade was standing in the bow of a flat aluminum airboat with a telemetry receiver in one hand and an antenna in the other, listening to a slow electronic pulse. "He's northwest," Wade said, "deep in the Strand, hasn't moved much since Sunday." Behind him, in the elevated driver's seat, Dale Hutchins pushed one earmuff up. Dale ran airboat tour out of a shed with a hand-painted sign, wrestled nuisance alligators on contract, and had never once in his life allowed a silence to continue. "That means he's got a kill," Dale said, "sitting on it, guarding the groceries." "That means he's got a kill," Wade agreed. On the bench behind them sat Tom Lassiter, a Big Cypress ranger 3 years from retirement, holding a clipboard that he had brought for no reason anyone could identify. Next to him, Darlene Prout sat with a snake hook across her knees. Darlene removed Burmese pythons from the preserve for the state, which meant she spent her working life reaching into dark water and pulling out things that objected. 4 people, 1 airboat. 19,000 square miles of swamp. That was the entire human population of the region that morning, and it was about to be described in an alien document as, and this is a direct translation, negligible. At 9:41, the sky did something the Everglades sky does not do. It went silent, the frogs stopped, the insects stopped, even the wind in the sawgrass stopped, and sawgrass does not stop. Then the clouds over the Strand pushed upward from underneath, like something had come up through them, and a shape slid out of the gray. It was gray itself, and enormous, and shaped like a wedge with the edges filed off. It had no visible engines. It made a sound like a refrigerator if a refrigerator were the size of a shopping mall. It drifted north, slowed, and settled down onto a cypress dome about a mile from the airboat, flattening a 150-year-old stand of bald cypress into pulp and pushing a gray wave of water out in a ring. Nobody on the airboat said anything for 4 full seconds. Then Dale said, "Well, that's not a helicopter." Wade lowered the antenna very slowly. The ship belonged to the Concordance of Measured Worlds, and the Concordance did not invade planets. The Concordance found that word distasteful. What the Concordance did was survey a world, classify every region of it, certify the classifications, and then annex the whole thing on the strength of the paperwork. Fleets came later and only to enforce a document that already existed. In 11,000 years, the system had never failed. It was elegant, it was efficient, it was, above all, correct. Overseer Prime Vokun Threll had personally certified 41 worlds. He was tall, narrow, and gray-green, with a long face that suggested a horse that had gone to law school. He wore the ash-colored sash of a certifying officer, and he had chosen this landing site himself, out of the entire planet, for one reason. The orbital survey of the region marked Region 9 had come back with the cleanest numbers he had ever seen. Population density, effectively 0. Permanent structures, 4. Road network, 2 lines. Industry, none. Military presence, none. Vegetation, uniform. Elevation change across 200 kilometers, less than 3 meters. Flat, empty, wet, and quiet. "It is a formality," Threll told his staff as the ramp came down. "We will certify Region 9 in 6 days, and the rest of the continent will follow the precedent. Begin the annexation broadcast." The broadcast went out across every frequency in southern Florida. It was formal, and it was long, and it explained in careful legal language that the wetland region had been assessed, found unoccupied, and brought under the administration of the Concordance of Measured Worlds, effective immediately. The total human audience for this historic announcement was 4 people in an airboat and a man asleep in a bait shop in Everglades City. Tom Lassiter listened to the whole thing on the airboat radio. When it finished, he looked down at his clipboard. "They can't do that," he said. "This is a national preserve," Darlene said. "I don't think they filed." "They did not file," Tom said, and something in his voice had gone genuinely offended. Wade was not listening. Wade had lifted the antenna again because the receiver in his hand had started ticking faster, and the ticking meant one thing. Deacon had moved. Wade turned in a slow half-circle, reading the signal strength, and the number that came back made him go very still. 300 yards from the ramp of that ship, something was moving through the sawgrass. It was not moving away from the noise and the heat and the strange gray hull. It was moving toward it. And out in the grass, low and close and almost too soft to hear, something chirped like a bird. The first day of the survey went beautifully, right up until the moment it did not. Overseer Threll deployed 9 survey drones at dawn, small disc-shaped units that hovered at chest height and cataloged everything they passed. Their job was to fill in the region file. Species, terrain, resources, hazards, nothing complicated. On a proper world, it took a week. By 10 in the morning, the file had 400 entries. By noon, it had 900. By evening, it had 6,112, and Survey Officer Nix was standing in front of the overseer with the posture of a man delivering bad news about a bridge. "Sir," Nix said, "the region will not classify. Everything classifies. Sir, we have logged 240 species of plant in 1 square kilometer. We have logged a fish that walks. We have logged a bird that swims underwater and then stands on a branch to dry itself out like laundry. We have logged a reptile 9 feet long that appears to do nothing at all for hours and then does everything at once. Then log them, sir. We have also logged 11,006 individual instances of a flying biological unit that lands on our personnel and removes their fluids." Threll paused. "Removes their fluids? Yes, sir. How large is it?" Nix held up 2 claws about a 1/4 inch apart. Threll stared at the gap between them for a long moment. Then he said, "Filter it out of the report." The mosquitoes did not agree to be filtered out of the report. By the second night, they had gotten inside 4 sets of environmental armor through the neck seal, and the medical bay had a waiting line. The quartermaster, an old and permanently tired officer named Bav, submitted a formal request for 6,000 replacement seals, and attached to it a note that read, "In the flat institutional language of the Concordance, the local atmosphere contains an organized biting element." That was the other problem, and it was worse than the insects. The Concordance translator was called a standards compliance unit. It did not translate what a person said. It translated what a person meant into approved administrative language, so that all records across all worlds would read the same way. On 400 planets, this had produced clean, dignified, uniform documentation. In the Everglades, it produced comedy. When a survey technician stepped into a solution hole, a soft spot in the limestone hidden under 2 feet of black water, and went down to his chest with a noise like a man being deleted. The standards compliance unit recorded it as, "The officer encounters an unscheduled elevation change and registers a formal objection. When another technician walked into a wall of sawgrass and discovered that sawgrass is called sawgrass because the edge of every single blade is lined with tiny serrated teeth that opened his sleeve and his forearm in one motion, the unit recorded it as, "The officer has been declined by the vegetation." When a third technician met an alligator, the unit's output was one line long. "The officer has revised his route." Threll read these entries every evening. Every evening, he told himself, the survey was proceeding normally. On the third morning, the Concordance made first contact with the human population of Region 9, and it went about as well as everything else. A patrol of 6 troopers came out of the Strand onto the 2-lane blacktop of Highway 41 and found a building. It was the only structure for 11 miles. It was made of wood. It measured 7 feet by 8 feet. It had a flag on a pole in front of it, a sign over the door, and a small metal slot in the wall. It was the HFY post office, and it is, in the real and verifiable world, the smallest post office in the United States. Sub-Overseer Grell walked around it twice. "It is small," he said. "It has a flag," said his trooper. "Sir, on 11 worlds the flag marks the administrative center." Grell studied the sign. He studied the slot. He studied the flag, which was hanging limp in the heat. "They have concentrated their command function into the smallest possible footprint," he said slowly, with real admiration. "It is hardened. It is decentralized. It is nearly invisible from orbit." He submitted it as the regional command node. Inside, Ranger Tom Lassiter, who had walked over to buy stamps, opened the door and found 6 armed aliens standing in a semicircle around a shed. There was a long silence. Tom looked them over the way a man looks over a tour group that has climbed a fence. "You need a permit," he said. Grell's translator produced a soft chime. "You are addressing the Concordance of Measured Worlds." "You're standing in a national preserve," Tom said. "You landed a vessel on federally protected wetland. That's a violation." "That's several violations, actually, and I'd want to look up the tonnage before I even start on the Cypress. We have annexed this region. You can't annex it, son. It's already got a designation." Tom flipped a page on his clipboard. "You want to talk to somebody about a special use permit? The office is in HFY. That's here. This is HFY." Grell looked at the shed. "This is the entire settlement." "That's right. Where is the rest of it?" "There isn't any rest of it." Grell filed a report that evening describing the humans of Region 9 as unarmed, unbothered, and procedurally aggressive. Threll found that phrase so strange he read it 3 times, but none of that was the problem. The problem started at 4 in the afternoon on the 3rd day, when Survey Drone 6 went out over the Fakahatchee Strand at low altitude, transmitting a steady tone, and dipped down to scan a stand of pond apple. The tone stopped, not faded, stopped. The last thing Drone 6 transmitted was 14 frames of imagery. 13 of them showed wet leaves. The 14th showed a shape coming out of the shadow under the pond apple, low and fast, and the color of dry grass, with a wide, flat head and eyes set forward. And the frame ended before the shape finished crossing it. They recovered the drone the next morning, 60 feet away, in 4 pieces at the bottom of a slough. Officer Nix built a file entry from the 14 frames. He gave it a designation because everything had to have a designation. Subject 44B medium quadruped, solitary, estimated mass 67 kilograms, behavior opportunistic. Threat assessment negligible. He sent it up the chain, and Overseer Threll approved it without reading past the last word. 3 miles away, in a hardwood hammock 2 feet above the waterline, a large male panther lay in the shade beside the covered remains of a white-tailed deer he had killed 2 days earlier. He had dragged leaves and grass over it, the way panthers do, because a kill is worth eating for 3 days and worth defending for all of them. Around his neck was a black collar with a small antenna, and the collar was still transmitting. And that afternoon, a Concordance ground patrol found a wide, flattened trail through the grass, leading uphill into the trees, and followed it because it looked like a road. 6 troopers went into that hammock. 5 came out. The missing trooper's name was Prell. They found his rifle at first light, 20 feet up in a strangler fig, hanging by the sling like somebody had put it there for safekeeping. They found Prell an hour later, sitting in 6 inches of water at the base of a cypress, entirely unharmed. With his helmet gone and his environmental armor opened down one side by 4 parallel tiers. He had been sitting there since dusk. He had not moved, he had not called out. When they asked him what happened, the Standards Compliance Unit worked for a moment, and then produced a sentence that would eventually be read aloud in a concordance hearing room by a very senior officer with a very flat voice. The officer reports that the grass has a management structure. Overseer Threll came down the ramp himself for that one. It is an animal, he said. It is 67 kilograms. You are a trained officer of the Concordance in powered armor. Prell said nothing. Prell had gone into that hammock with a plasma rifle, and he had learned something in about 1.5 seconds that Threll was going to need another 6 days, and most of his fleet to learn. He never heard it coming, that was the thing. There had been no roar, everyone expects a roar. Every predator on every world Threll had certified announced itself, because announcing yourself is how you avoid a fight you do not need. Florida Panthers do not roar. They cannot. The anatomy is wrong for it. They chirp like a bird, they whistle, they growl low in the chest, and when they hunt, they make no sound at all. That is not folklore. That is a fact you can look up. Wade Buckley knew that fact better than anyone alive, and on the 4th morning, sitting in Dale's airboat at the edge of the Strand with the receiver in his lap, he worked out what was happening. And it made him feel sick. The signal from Panther 241 had not moved out of the area. It should have. Any sane animal, faced with a mile-long vessel and 300 armed strangers and constant low-frequency vibration, leaves. Deer had left. Hogs had left. Even the alligators had shifted south. Deacon had not left, and Wade knew exactly why, and it was the simplest reason in the natural world. They had landed in the middle of his range. 200 square miles that he had spent 6 years walking, marking, defending, and feeding from. He had a kill in it. He had a territory in it. There was nowhere else for him to go, because every direction out of that range was another male's range, and Florida does not have spare room for panthers anymore. He was not being brave. He was not defending humanity. He was a cat who had been cornered inside his own house by people who kept walking past his refrigerator. He's not going to stop, Wade said quietly. Dale said, good. No, it's not good. Wade turned and looked at him. There are 200 of these animals left on Earth, 200 Dale. If those things kill him, that's not a story, that's a percentage. Nobody had an answer for that. Darlene did, eventually. She was cleaning her snake hook with a rag and she did not look up. Then we make sure they're always looking the wrong way, she said. That is how 4 civilians ended up conducting an unpaid counter-surveillance operation against an interstellar empire, using an airboat, a Python contractor, a ranger with a clipboard, and 19 years of collar data. They did not fight anybody, that is important. Not one of them fired a shot in the entire 6 days. What they did was much worse. They gave bad directions. Tom Lassiter, in full uniform, walked up to Concordance checkpoints on Highway 41 and formally informed them that the region required guided access. Then he guided them. He guided them into the deepest marl prairie in the preserve, where the mud is the consistency of setting concrete, and the water is exactly the wrong depth for everything. 200 kilograms of powered armor plus a soft bottom is not a fight. It is a physics lesson. Darlene walked a Concordance biology team to what she described as a shallow crossing. It was a shallow crossing. It was also the water where she had pulled a 14-foot Burmese python out the previous spring, and she mentioned that afterward. Dale offered airboat transport, and then drove them across 9 miles of sawgrass at 40 miles an hour with the engine screaming 18 inches behind their heads. Which is a normal Tuesday in Ochopi, and an interrogation technique everywhere else. And Wade, quietly with a receiver in his lap, kept track of exactly where Deacon was, so that every route they suggested went nowhere near him. They were protecting the cat. The cat, entirely by accident, was protecting them. Because in that same stretch of days, the Concordance lost a sentry post at the northern perimeter, lost 2 more drones, and lost the ability to keep any trooper standing watch alone after dark. It did not matter how bright the lights were. Something crossed that perimeter every night, and it never came the same way twice, and it never made a sound. On the 5th morning, Sub-Overseer Grell walked the perimeter himself and found a set of tracks in the marl. 4 toes. No claw marks because the claws had been retracted. A pad the width of his own hand. He followed them to a spot beside the ramp of the vessel where they stopped and turned and faced the ship. The animal had stood there, in the open, for some time. Grell went inside and requested an upward revision of the threat assessment for Subject 44B. It was the first of 5 revisions, and by the end of the week, that file entry would be read on 1100 worlds. Threll approved the revision. Then he did the thing that ended the survey. He ordered a hunt. The Concordance carried a specialist unit for exactly this situation. A fauna suppression team, 6 troopers trained to remove a problem species from a survey zone without damaging the survey zone. Because a damaged region cannot be certified, and an uncertified region cannot be annexed. That rule was 11,000 years old. It was why they had never once in all of this simply fired on the swamp from orbit. The team leader asked how they were expected to find one animal in 19,000 square miles of identical terrain. Officer Nix smiled for the first time all week. "We do not have to find it," he said. "It is broadcasting." He put the frequency up on the panel, a slow, steady, artificial pulse. The unmistakable signature of a transmitter mounted on the animal itself. "They have equipped it," Nix said. "Sir, this is not wildlife. This is a deployed asset." And 2 miles away, in a cypress head where the light came down in bars, Wade Buckley's receiver ticked steadily in his lap. And Wade watched the fauna suppression team walk down the ramp with tracking gear tuned to the exact same signal he had been listening to for 6 years. And he understood all at once that the collar he had put on that cat to protect him was about to get him killed. Wade had 4 hours and a bad idea. The bad idea was this. The collar transmitted on a fixed frequency, and Wade had been receiving that frequency since Deacon was 3 years old. But the Panther team did not only have receivers. They had transmitters too, dozens of them, sitting in a locked cabinet in a field office in Naples, because collars are tested before they go on an animal. And a tested collar has to broadcast to be tested. "How many?" Darling asked. 14 last I looked. "How far away?" 90 minutes there, 90 minutes back, if the water's not over the road at Turner River. Dale was already turning the airboat. "The water was over the road at Turner River. It is August. The water is always over the road in August." They went anyway, and they came back at 2 in the afternoon with 14 test collars in a milk crate. And by then the sky in the west had gone the color of an old bruise, and the air had that copper smell that means the afternoon is about to happen. Because here is the other thing about the Everglades in August, and this one is not folklore either. Florida is struck by more lightning than any other state in the country. Central and South Florida sit under a storm engine that fires almost every single afternoon in the wet season. When the sea breezes off the Gulf and the Atlantic collide over the peninsula and shove all that wet air straight up. It happens on a schedule. Locals plan their day around it. Overseer Threll had certified 41 worlds. On every one of them, weather was noise in the data. He had filtered it out of the report. At 3:15, Wade, Dale, Tom, and Darling split up and walked 14 test collars into 14 different locations across 11 square miles of Big Cypress. They put them in cypress heads and hammocks and gator holes and up in the crook of a sable palm. They put one on Tom's insistence in a culvert. Then they got out. At 3:40, the fauna suppression team's tracking panel lit up with 15 identical signatures spread across 11 square miles, all broadcasting at once. The team leader stared at it for 8 seconds. "Sir," he said into his link, "there are 15 of them. There is a specific silence that happens on a warship when a number changes." Nick said, "Repeat. 15 confirmed transmitters, distributed, non-overlapping, sir. The spacing is regular." It was regular. Wade was a field biologist. Field biologists space their sample points on a grid, because that is how you get clean data, and he had done it out of pure professional habit while sweating through his shirt in a swamp. To the Concordance, a regular grid meant one thing, and it meant it on 1100 worlds: deployment. "They have not equipped one animal," Nick said slowly. "They have equipped a unit." Threll came into the operations bay at a speed that was not dignified. "How many?" 15, sir, possibly more outside our detection radius." Threll looked at the grid. 15 silent, unseen predators, positioned at intervals, holding a perimeter around his landing site, not one of which had ever been observed by a survey drone that survived the encounter. "Region 9 is not empty," he said. "No, sir. Region 9 is a defended installation." And with that single sentence, Overseer Prime Vokun Threll of the Concordance of Measured Worlds made the largest strategic error of his career. And it was a completely reasonable error, and it was built entirely out of accurate data. He committed the fauna suppression team, plus 2 full ground companies, into the Fakahatchee strand to break a perimeter that did not exist. Defended by 14 plastic boxes and 1 extremely annoyed cat. The Fakahatchee strand is the deepest, wettest, darkest part of that whole country. It is a linear swamp forest, cypress and royal palm shading out the sun, standing water most of the year with a floor of limestone that is not flat but pitted, full of solution holes that can drop a man to his waist without warning. The state calls it the Amazon of North America. Wade called it the Strand and did not go in without telling someone. 312 Concordance troopers went into it at 4 in the afternoon in full powered armor. Within 20 minutes, the formation was gone, not destroyed, just gone, dissolved into 60 separate groups picking their way through a place that had no lines of sight longer than 30 feet. Within 40 minutes, 6 of them had walked into solution holes. Within an hour, the Sawgrass had opened enough seals that a third of the force was breathing raw Everglades air, which is warm, wet, full of insects, and smells strongly of sulfur from the decaying muck. Within 90 minutes, they reached the first collar. It was sitting in a cypress knee, blinking. A trooper picked it up. It was a black plastic box weighing 11 ounces with a strap on it. He turned it over in his hands, and behind him, quite close, something chirped. He said afterward that it sounded like a bird. That was what he could not get past. He said it sounded exactly like a bird. The Standards Compliance Unit logged his next transmission as the officer withdraws his previous assessment. Deacon had not been guarding a grid. Deacon had been guarding a deer carcass in a hammock in the middle of his own range. And the Concordance of Measured Worlds had just walked 312 armed personnel directly through his kitchen. What followed was not a battle. Wade would insist on that point for the rest of his life, in every interview, every hearing, and one very awkward dinner with a 4-star general. What followed was one territorial animal, moving through terrain he had walked every night for 6 years, at dusk, in his own home, against people who could not see 30 feet, could not hear over their own armor, and could not tell the sound of a bird from the sound of the last thing they would ever be surprised by. He hit the flank of a column and was gone before they turned. He came down out of a live oak onto a squad leader and was back in the dark before the squad fired, and they fired at each other. Because that is what happens when 9 armed strangers panic in a forest at dusk. At 6:10, the Northern Company broke and ran, and running in the Strand means solution holes, and solution holes mean broken legs. At 6:20, Sub-Overseer Grell ordered a full withdrawal to the vessel. At 6:22, the storm arrived. It came in off the Gulf the way it does every afternoon in August. A black shelf of cloud rolling east over Everglades City and Chokoloskee with a wall of wind ahead of it. And it hit the Strand at 6:22 with 60-mile-an-hour gusts and rained so heavy that the water on the ground jumped. Overseer Threll had a vessel with a defensive lattice. The lattice ran through 4 raised mast assemblies, each one 110 feet tall, each one carrying an active electromagnetic charge. Each one now the highest and most electrically inviting object standing in a landscape that had never had anything taller than a cypress tree in 10,000 years. The Everglades had spent every August of the last several thousand years dropping lightning onto whatever was tallest. That evening, it had 4 excellent options. The first strike hit the forward mast at 6:31 and traveled down through the lattice into the primary distribution ring. Every light in the vessel went out at once. The second strike hit the aft mast 90 seconds later, and this time something in the lower hull made a noise like a church bell being hit with a truck. Quartermaster Bav, standing in the dark in 3 inches of water that was coming in through a seam that had not existed that morning, filed the last entry of his career. The regional weather is not participating. Outside, 312 troopers were trying to get back to a vessel they could no longer see. In a storm, in the dark, in water that was rising. In a forest that was actively taking them apart, and every single one of them had exactly one thought, and it was not about the concordance. They had all heard about the bird sound by then. Threll came down the ramp at 6:50 with Grell, Nix, and 11 troopers, into rain that hit hard enough to sting. Because his personnel were scattered across 4 kilometers, and a certifying officer of the concordance does not sit inside while his people are outside. Whatever else the man was, he was that. They pushed west along the only firm ground available, which was the raised shoulder of Highway 41, and after 400 meters, the road passed over a concrete box culvert set into the embankment. Nix stopped and put his light on it. It was a tunnel, concrete. 8 feet high, wide enough for a truck, running clean under the highway from the wet ground on one side to the wet ground on the other. There was fencing angled along the road for a mile in both directions, funneling toward the mouth of it. "Sir," Nix said, his voice had changed. "Sir, this is engineered. It is a drainage feature. Sir, the fencing directs movement toward the entrance. This is not drainage, this is a channel. It is a covered approach." He turned, and his light found the fence line running away into the rain. "Sir, they have built a network to move their assets under the road undetected." He was, once again, completely right about the facts, and completely wrong about everything else. Florida has built dozens of wildlife underpasses across South Florida, real, concrete, verifiable structures with fencing exactly like that, and they were built for one purpose. They were built so that Florida Panthers could cross the highway without being hit by cars. The state started building them in the 80s because vehicle strikes were killing the last of them. Panthers use them constantly. It is one of the most successful conservation projects in the country. Threll walked to the mouth of the culvert and looked into it. Somewhere behind him, a mast took a third strike, and for one full second the entire swamp went white. And in that second of light, Overseer Prime Vokun Threll, certifier of 41 worlds, saw what was standing at the far end of the tunnel. It was not 15. It was 1. It was 148 pounds, soaked to the skin, tail low, ears flat, eyes reflecting the light back at him in 2 flat discs, and it was breathing hard. Because it had been working for 2 hours. It had a black collar around its neck with a small antenna on it. It was not charging. It was not roaring. It was standing in the middle of a tunnel that human beings had poured out of concrete, specifically, so that this animal, and the 200 like it, would not be erased from the earth. And it was looking at him with the total, uncomplicated confidence of something standing in its own doorway. Threll did not move. He did not raise his sidearm. Later at the hearing, he was asked why not, and he gave an answer that ended up printed in a training manual. He said, "I understood the arrangement." Behind him, Nix whispered, "Sir." "Sir, orders." Threll watched the animal a moment longer. Then he turned around and walked back out into the rain and opened a channel to every concordance unit on the surface of the planet. "This is Overseer Prime Threll. All units withdraw to the vessel. Region 9 survey is terminated." "Certification is withdrawn," Grell said. "Sir, on what grounds?" Threll stood in the dark on a 2-lane road in Collier County, Florida. With water running off his sash and a strand of sawgrass stuck to his armor, and gave the grounds. "The region is occupied," he said. "It was occupied before we landed. We surveyed the wrong species." The withdrawal took 11 hours. It was not orderly. 291 troopers made it back to the vessel. 21 did not make it back that night and were recovered the following morning by, and this is in the record, 4 humans in an airboat who found them, gave them water, and drove them to the road. Dale Hutchins charged them for the ride. He would tell you he did it for the principal. He put the money in the donation jar at the ranger station. The last thing the concordance did before lifting off was accept a document from Ranger Tom Lassiter, who walked up the ramp at 9 the next morning, in a clean uniform, and handed Overseer Threll a written notice of violation for the destruction of protected wetland, with a case number, a citation code, and a 60-day window to respond. Threll read it twice. Then he did something no officer of the concordance had done in 11,000 years. He signed it. The vessel lifted at 11:40 on the morning of the 7th day. listing about 3 degrees to port. With 2 mast assemblies fused solid, and a hull seam packed from the inside with what the engineering log would only describe as local vegetation. It went up through the clouds, and it did not come back. The Florida National Guard arrived at 1:15 in the afternoon. They came down Highway 41 in a column of 40 vehicles, and they found a flattened cypress dome, a lot of standing water, a road covered in mud, and 4 civilians sitting on an airboat trailer eating sandwiches. The colonel got out, he looked at the crater, he looked at the sandwiches. "Where are they?" "Gone," Wade said. "Gone where?" "Up," Dale said and pointed in case that was unclear. The colonel took his hat off and put it back on. "Who repelled them?" Wade thought about how to answer that. He thought about the 14 test collars, and the milk crate, and the road at Turner River, and Tom's violation notice. And the fact that not one shot had been fired by a single human being in 6 days. "The swamp did," he said. That was the official answer for about 4 months, and then the concordance transcripts started coming out, and it stopped being the official answer because the transcripts were much more specific. The concordance did what the concordance always does. It filed. The hearing ran for 19 days. Overseer Prime Vokun Threll was not stripped of rank, which surprised everybody, including Threll. What happened instead was that the Assembly listened to 19 days of testimony, read 6,000 pages of survey data, played the 14 frames from Drone 6, and then did something structural. They amended the survey doctrine. The old doctrine assessed a world by population, infrastructure, and armament. The new doctrine added a 4th column, and the 4th column was written by a very tired officer named Nix, and it read, "Assess what the population protects." Because that was the part they had missed. It was in the data the entire time. A region with no people, no industry, and no military, threaded with fences and tunnels and monitoring equipment and boundary markers. Patrolled by uniformed personnel who carried no weapons and issued documents instead. That is not an empty region. That is a region under guard. The humans had built 200 miles of fencing and dozens of concrete underpasses, and spent 40 years and hundreds of millions of dollars for the benefit of about 200 animals. And had then defended those animals from an interstellar power, at 0 personal profit, using an airboat. The Assembly found that genuinely difficult to process. It appears in the record 11 times. Threll was asked at the end whether the Panther had been a weapon. "No," he said, "it was a resident. We were the incident." The final classification entry for Earth was approved by the Assembly and distributed to every certifying officer in concordance space. It is 4 lines long. It is still in force. Earth, do not survey. Surface may appear unoccupied. It is not. Local population protects things that can kill you. Southern wetland region, do not enter the grass. Back in Collier County, life went back to being August. Tom Lassiter never got a response to the violation notice, but he kept the signed copy in a frame behind the counter of the HFY post office. That same 7 by 8 foot wooden shed that an interstellar empire had classified as the regional command node. Tourists still stop there. Tom still tells them every single time that they need a permit and then laughs and then sells them a stamp. Darlene Prout went back to pulling pythons out of the water. She was asked once on a national broadcast whether she had been afraid during the invasion. She said, "Of them? No." Dale Hutchins put a new sign on his shed. It says alien tested. He has never explained it to a single customer, and business has never been better. And Wade Buckley drove out to the Strand on a Tuesday in October, in the dry season, when the water had dropped and the air had finally let go, and sat on the tailgate with his receiver in his lap and the antenna up. The signal came back slow and steady. Panther number 241, alive. 9 miles northwest, deep in the Fakahatchee, right in the middle of his range, exactly where he had been for 6 years and exactly where he had every intention of staying. He had no idea he had ended an invasion. He had no concept of the concordance of measured worlds. He had never heard of an Overseer Prime. He had defended a deer carcass, a hammock, and about 200 square miles of wet ground, because that ground was his, and because there was nowhere else on Earth left for him to go. Wade listened to the ticking for a long time. Then he wrote the date in his field book, and under it one line, range intact. If this one landed for you, drop a comment and tell me the moment you would put in the trailer, because I read every single one. And share it with somebody who thinks the loudest thing in the room is the dangerous one. 200 left. That is the whole species. And for 6 days in August, one of them held the line for all of us and never once made a sound doing it. Because the concordance was right about the Everglades. It is quiet out there. That was always the warning.